Our next panel will explore a topic that often doesn't receive the attention it deserves, minor aquifers in Texas. While these aquifers are frequently overshadowed by the Big Nine, they are essential water sources for hundreds of thousands of people across the state. This afternoon, our panel will share their knowledge on the importance of minor aquifers, provide some intriguing insights, and discuss strategies to better manage and protect these important resources. It is my pleasure to introduce Amy Bush. She's going to moderate the panel. Amy is a hydrologist and fellow water data enthusiast. I was going to say nerd.
Nerd is it.
With RMBJ Geo. Amy has worked extensively with districts across the state, including on several projects on minor aquifers. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy to introduce her panel.
All right, come across. Excuse me. All right, guys. I'm well aware that I'm standing between you and happy hour because I'm also standing between me and happy hour, and that's an awkward place to be. So we are going to get started. We're going to talk about some fun nerd stuff, and we're going to hit the high points that we've discussed. The first thing I want to do is not to reread what your program says, but do a real quick introduction of the folks that are up here with me. We have a fantastic panel. We have Blaine Hicks, who is a geoscientist on staff with the GCD. Fun fact, Blaine and some of his cohorts just started a new company. They are doing groundwater availability certifications in places that are not their district. We have Mr. Urbanczyk. He is been at Sol Ross for 33 years, is that right? Teaching students about geology. His fun fact is he would rather be in a canoe doing some studies in, where was that? Let's see.
Lower Canyons.
The Lower Canyons, where the Edward Trinity Aquifer is the river. We have Miss Natalie, who needs no introduction, with TWDB. I'll only tell you about her. She's a 6th-generation Texan, and she loves cheese. We have Dr. Bill Hutchison, who has been doing geoscience work for over 40 years. If you in the room have not worked with Dr. Bill, yes, you have. You just don't know that he touched your model. So I'm going to start by handing this off to Natalie. We're talking about minor aquifers. What makes it minor? Why do we have minor aquifers? What's going on here?
Well, I'll start with the why.
Okay.
Why we have aquifers, period, is because we need to know what we're dealing with if we're going to manage and plan for it. I'd like to take you through a very brief history of aquifers first, and not like geologic history. It'll be briefer than that. It's a history of aquifer delineations at the Water Development Board. So in the 1961 State Water Plan, the first State Water Plan, there was very minimal mention of groundwater at all. There was a statement in that plan that we can't do orderly development of our groundwater because, number one, there's no state control of it, and number two, that there just isn't enough information on it. In the meantime, in the 50s and 60s, the Texas Water Development Board and the USGS and I think the Bureau of Economic Geology were doing a bunch of reconnaissance studies all across the state to collect more information on all of our aquifers. And so it wasn't until the 1968 State Water Plan that we get our first maps of our major and minor aquifers. And in that plan, there are only seven minor aquifers listed there. Most of them we still have today. One of them was slightly different. But we also got our very first definition of what a minor aquifer is, and that is kind of nebulous, but it's a large aquifer that provides relatively small amounts of water, or it's a small aquifer that provides significant amount of water. And that's still the definition that we go by today. And so now we have 22 minor aquifers, which are all up there on the screen. And for the how these aquifers get designated, it's all in the Water Development Board's role to designate these aquifers. And the definition of a designated aquifer in our Chapter 356 rules is just any aquifer that's designated in the State Water Plan. And so that's why I bring up this history of the State Water Plans. But currently there are some proposed rule changes for Chapter 356, and there's a slight adjustment to that to just be designated by the board. So take a look at those. But however, a delineation or a kind of adjustment to aquifer boundaries happens. That's happened many times over the years because we get more information. We really want to work with the local districts who are actually going to be managing those aquifers before we make any big decisions. And so a really great example of how this worked is the Cross Timbers Aquifer in Blaine's district.
Right, so we'll go over to Blaine about the newest, latest, greatest minor aquifer, Cross Timbers, the big pink blob in north central Texas. Blaine, tell us, why did this get designated? How did this get designated? What was the process?
Yeah, so Upper Trinity was kind of founded in response to the large volumes of pumping in the early 2000s during the Barnett Shale boom. In both the Trinity and the Cross Timbers, it was previously called the Paleozoic aquifers. There was very little information available on the Paleozoic aquifers at the time. So in 2012, the Bureau of Economic Geology put out an exploratory report on the feasibility for using alternative water sources for shale gas well completions. And then in 2014, Upper Trinity hired Interra to calibrate that model with water levels and provide regional estimates of pumping impacts and groundwater availability. And then in 2016, Upper Trinity put in a formal request to the Texas Water Development Board for minor aquifer designation. The following year, in 2017, it was officially named a minor aquifer, named the Cross Timbers. In 2021, the Texas Water Development Board put out the conceptual model report for the Cross Timbers, and currently we're waiting the final GAM report. And the reason for designation, like I said, there's very little information and data available on the aquifer. And the district is seeing population move westward into the rural areas, and it's transitioning from oil and gas use to more domestic use. And the Cross Timbers is the only water source in large portions of that area in the western part of our district where the Trinity is pinched out. The district wanted the minor aquifer designation to qualify for state-funded models. So we could better understand and manage the aquifer and serve those rural communities that are growing rapidly.
All right, well, speaking of not enough data, let's skip over here to Bill and talk about the issues that we're seeing with these minor aquifers. And just to challenge you, you don't get 2 hours, 5 minutes.
I can do that. It's yep. Time for a break. Basically, when you talk about minor aquifers or any aquifer, one of the dangers is that folks tend to think, or there's the potential for folks to think, that water in those aquifers is all there by itself and it's not going to interact with anything. But in fact, these aquifers interact with each other or with major aquifers. A very good example of that are the Sparta and the Queen City, which are the orangish, yellowish ones there in the that streak from the border with Louisiana all the way down almost to Mexico. And these are younger units that overlie the Carrizo-Wilcox. Now, some of the studies that we've done as part of permit reviews on these show that a lot of the water that's being pumped out of the Carrizo is in fact sourced from the Queen City. So when you start talking about aquifers, don't think that they're these isolated little units that you can just develop and manage. You have to understand the connection. For example, at least in the Lost Pines area, a couple of these permit applications, anywhere from 13 to 25% of the pumped water is being sourced from these minor aquifers, even though you're pumping it out of the Carrizo. Now, a lot of this revolves around we need data. And data are important. These aquifers are different sizes. They're not being used as much. So obviously there's not going to be as much data. Down in GMA 13, down in the southern part of the Carrizo-Wilcox area, I just completed updating that model. And you can kind of break down the number of data points or targets that we use to calibrate the model. In the Carrizo-Wilcox, we're talking about on the order of 30 to 35 targets per 100 square miles. But when you're looking at the Sparta, we're only at about 5 targets per square mile, and in the Queen City, about 7. So it's hard to get data because if there aren't any wells, can't collect data. But in terms of being able to identify needs, that's certainly an area where if there's an opportunity to get more data, it should be achieved. But because not just for the purposes of the managing the minor aquifer, but also this interaction and getting a much better handle on that down the road.
Interaction, lack of data, all standard problems.
Yep.
Let's go to quirky problems. What about non-standard problems, non-standard issues? Because you got a bunch of nerds together talking about stuff. What's the thing that comes out is the fun stories. And so we have these aquifers that have been designated, as Natalie said, either a large area with a small amount of data or a small amount of water, or a small area with a large amount of water. But there's also some other really weird stuff going on with minor aquifers. And so I'm going to pass this over to Kevin right now to talk about the igneous aquifer, and I'm going to zoom you forward a slide.
Okay, thank you. I want to point out also that I'm on the board for Brewster County, which is right partly in that igneous aquifer extent there. Unlike other aquifers in Texas, it's igneous, the term, it's volcanic mostly, this evidence of this magmatic activity that long since stopped, but left rocks there that serve as an aquifer for us. If you look at the Brewster County version of it, it's only the far sort of western part of the county. But our issues with understanding water in a volcanic terrain like that has to do with there's not a lot of sort of lateral continuity, maybe is one way to put that. It's the result of a bunch of different volcanic centers that again, they're 30, 40 million years ago, roughly. Nothing's really connected. And so we can build models, and in fact, I was involved with the model that was completed in 2004, and I believe there's a new one coming out soon. But you know, we're limited by data. We don't really understand how, again, like the volcanic rocks that are part of that system, they're not really connected. We don't have enough well control. We don't have enough information about where the water is. You know, for example, in Alpine, we believe that our aquifer is the Cottonwood Spring basalt. It's a basalt lava flow, and it's actually a stack of lavas that erupted, and there's a lot of breccia associated with those lava flows and maybe sediment in between. There's regional faults that contribute to porosity and permeability, but nothing's really continuous. It's not really like an Ogallala, say. It's not that kind of lateral continuity. We don't really have that. So, you know, we're limited by data and understanding it. We have our MAG currently. The number is in our management plan is about 2,600 acre-feet per year, I believe. Brewster County has a sum total of 9 commercial production permits that add up to a total of 600. And one of the reasons for that is there are other commercial water uses. We just haven't gotten everybody on board with it. But basically, that number hopefully illustrates it's pretty minor. Those are pretty small numbers. Brewster County has 10,000 people. So our situation is really different than other areas of the state where there's a lot more people.
Right. So management comes into that.
Yeah.
Right. And so I guess on the map here, we have a big pink blob. The aquifer, not a big pink blob. Takeaway.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we're talking about how they were defined. You know, the older maps have 3 igneous aquifers, if you're familiar with that older map, pre-2004, really. And the documentation that Natalie provided, apparently John Ashworth had kind of drawn them around the major production where Alpine, Fort Davis, and Marfa are. And then with James Beach and the 2004 model, we made it a big blob. But again, it's a bunch of disconnected, you know, volcanic centers that I don't see that lateral continuity.
Right.
I don't think you could say pumping here is going to affect something there. DFCs are another issue, but we probably don't have time to get into that.
No. So that's not the only place we see that. And so the other place we see this is the Blaine aquifer, which starts there in the southeast corner of the Panhandle and runs south. It kind of looks like a big knife dropping down there. I'm gonna have Blaine talk about the Blaine, just because I think that's fun.
What a great name for an aquifer. No, I don't have any personal experience in the Blaine, but it does fall in that quirky minor aquifer category. The water found in there is in dissolved gypsum and anhydrite beds. So the water is super salty, high sulfate content. So it's not fit for human consumption. Most of the water is used for irrigation purposes. I looked it up, roughly 17,000 acre feet per year is pumped. 97% of that is for irrigation.
I have some very bad news for you.
What's that?
I grew up in the Blaine Aquifer. Humans do consume that. I thought water was supposed to have white floaty things in it when I was young. If you live there, though, you're used to chewing your water before you swallow.
Sounds kind of crunchy.
So the next thing when we were talking through this is not only do we have, normal minor aquifers, and we have quirky minor aquifers, we have not minor aquifers. There's a lot of aquifers out there that are not at all labeled, named, considered as aquifers by the state at all. And why is that? What's going on there? Why is this not an aquifer? And is there a reason for it to not be, or are we just not there yet? Have we not managed to get it done, or have we decided not to do it? I think I'm going to start there. I'm going to go back to Kevin and talk about the Santa Elena.
Okay, could you advance that slide?
Sure.
So Brewster County, it's a big county. Again, we have 10,000 of us out there. We have looking at the map, probably half of it doesn't have a defined aquifer. And that half includes Big Bend National Park down at the south end. It includes Lajitas, Terlingua, Studi Butte, Terlingua Ranch, all that stuff in that big open space in the south end of the county. That part of our county has received a lot of recent development. It seems that since COVID, for whatever reason, a lot of people have decided that they want to at least purchase property out there. So Terlingua Ranch is divided into a lot of little tracts. A lot of those have sold. And then Studi Butte has a water supply corporation. Lajitas has its own water supply. Studi Butte RV Park does, and Terlingua Ranch. So there's actually a lot of development and not a lot of people. We're not going to really see a huge increase in population, but there's a lot of new wells have gone in, and there's a demand because a lot of these properties have been developed to be vacation rentals. So it's kind of hard to tell what that use is going to be. But almost all of that comes from basically it's an Edwards equivalent, if we want to use that term. It's the Santa Elena limestone, and that's the aquifer for the water supply corporations that are there. So we just kind of have a question, should we as a district attempt to get it designated? Do we want to do that? And I'm learning because I'm not sure if we do or not. The aquifer it's not listed as a minor or major aquifer, but it is mentioned in our rules. And in fact, our rules stipulate a 0 DFC also. So we actually recognize it in the rules as a source that we could permit exempt wells for example, but with a 0 DFC number. So that's really the only information we have about it, except for that we're aware that it's there. And again, it supports what is a pretty hotly developed area recently. And I mentioned that Brewster County only has 9 production permits, but we're just about to bring Studi Butte, Lajitas, and Terlingua Ranch on. Those original 9 were all in the igneous aquifer. So now we're going to have 3 permits that are in this unknown or unnamed aquifer. So that's where we are. I'm still trying to learn. We've got one of our board members and one of our employees here. We want to learn. We want to know to make the right decision about whether we would like to ask that it be designated, or can we get state funding? I think we can, even though it's not, to develop maybe some more science related to it because the data is not there.
Right. Well, this seems like a common thread. I'm gonna skip over to Bill now to talk about another not aquifer, the Catahoula.
Okay, so the Catahoula is, go back to the map. Oh.
Okay, well, I don't know.
All right, well, the Catahoula is an interesting one because it's essentially the bottom part of the Gulf Coast, and sort of associated with the Awa-Jackson Gulf Coast boundary. Back when the model was first put together, some of the Catahoula was included in the Gulf Coast model, but not all of it. The new model the USGS did ostensibly has all of the Catahoula in it. It's certainly something that we're interested in the Bluebonnet District in Walker County because there's a lot of wells in it, but it's never been defined as an aquifer. It's never been formally part of any of the GAMs until just now. So that's an aquifer that has never fallen into the category of a named aquifer, but is something that's important to Walker County for the Bluebonnet District.
Well, I'm realizing now that I also skipped a really fun one that it's technically named, but it definitely falls under the quirky, and it's the Lapan. I wanted you to talk to us about that one too.
Right. So the Lapan-Kickapoo District is the one that manages the Lapan aquifers, that blue blob right in the middle of the state. The district basically covers the entire aquifer. And they manage it in such a way that basically it's used for agricultural purposes, and every year it's pumped down, and every year it fills back up. So it's not really something you can have a DFC for because it's constantly changing. Over the long term, it doesn't change because it's using the storage every year. A DFC was developed for it in 2010 in the original round of DFCs, but then when the explanatory reports were required starting in 2011, a decision was made to call it not relevant for purposes of joint planning because it was managed by one entity. It wasn't affecting anybody else in the surrounding area. And so we documented how it was not relevant for purposes of joint planning because it was its own entity. And that has been the case in 2016 and 2021 when we did the last DFC.
So that turns into not just the science side of this, but this bleeds over just really directly into the management side of how we handle these minor aquifers.
Right. Yeah. Management, the putting GAMs together and putting models together, getting data, all those sorts of things is just one part of the equation. The other part is the management. So the Lapan, a model's been developed. They've been the Lapan-Kickapoo District's been managing it they're one of the old districts.
Yeah.
So you're seeing the blending of how you might want to manage something once you have the information on it.
Okay. And so that's kind of what Kevin was talking about. Do we want to designate one? Do we not want to designate one? We're managing it on site. Do we want some larger information out there? So we want the state to step in. And I'm gonna use that to get back over to Natalie. So at what point should the state step in and designate one? At what point do districts want the state to come and help designate one? How does that process work? Fill us in.
I would say for the most part, if there is like a new aquifer or not new, but an unnamed aquifer that a district is interested in designating, that they just come talk to us and we'll figure out what kind of data we have to make that happen. I think that there are sometimes some like upsides and downsides to actually having a designated aquifer, and I think the Santa Elena limestone is maybe a good example for that. On the upside, kind of like with the cross timbers, you can get a groundwater availability model out of it because we have to create groundwater models for every major and minor aquifer. On the downside, you might not have very much data in that aquifer, so what's that model even going to tell you until you actually have the science and the data to support that model development? And I think another upside would be that it can be an upside or a downside, is that districts have to create desired future conditions for all the major and minor aquifers, and then you can achieve or manage that aquifer to achieve that DFC. And I know that there's some various views about what abilities a district has in that regard, but that is one of the upsides of that. But then at the same time, you might not have data to actually monitor what that DFC is. And then I think there are some additional complications in terms of a DFC or no DFC whenever it comes to how the groundwater planning process feeds into the regional water planning process. Because if there is no DFC, but people know that there's an aquifer there, you might have regions come in to look at that aquifer, and if you're not defining the groundwater availability, then you don't have quite as much control over that whenever it gets to the region.
Gotcha. So in following up with, If we want to designate, then we need data. Blaine, will you tell us just a little bit about what you guys did with the Cross Timbers Aquifer when you very first got it designated? The first thing you went and did was?
Yeah, so we have we have 278 monitoring wells as of this week in our district. 41 of those are Cross Timbers monitoring wells. And in the last few years, the district has actually drilled 2 wells ourselves in the Cross Timbers. The first one was in 2020 in Montague County. That's the north part of the district up by Lake Nocona. We were given a lot in a subdivision to drill this well, and it was kind of an exploratory project to find usable water for a water provider there. We drilled to a total depth of 820 feet. We targeted about a 10-foot zone at 560. I was on site logging the cuttings. We got to use our logging rig, geophysical log the well. Completed the well. It actually made 70 gallons a minute out of that interval, which was exciting, but the water quality wasn't quite there. TDS was around 2,700.
Crunchy.
So, and then in 2023, we had another exciting project in Parker County around the community of Brock. That's a rapidly growing area with very little water. The Trinity is pinched out. That's the Strawn group of the Cross Timbers, and if you know anything about that, you could drill a 500-foot well, and you're lucky if you get 5 gallons a minute out of it. So we actually drilled that well to 1,200 feet. We completed it across a tight sandstone around 1,100. And unfortunately, it made less than a gallon a minute. And on top of that, TDS was around 34,000.
A little beyond crunchy.
Yep. And there were volatile organics in the water as well. And then on top of that, it ended up being a flowing well, very, very slowly flowed all the way to the surface. So we decided for environmental concerns, we plugged that well. So that just kind of speaks to the erratic behavior of the Cross Timbers and the need for more data.
Right. So we keep running into this idea of we really need data. We really have problems getting data. This is really getting driven by, and Kevin brought this up in one of our talks, we have a lot of development. There's a lot of these smaller tracts that they're trying to put in wells. You were talking about subdivisions donating an acre to look at this. There's nothing in about any of this that exists in a vacuum. And so if we want to designate something, if we're going to have a model, we have to have the data. We've got a district that's going out and trying to find data. Okay, well, now we've run into problems. Now, and so all of these things work together hand in hand, and there's no way to separate any of it out, much like there's no way to separate some of this interaction out between the minor aquifers and the major aquifers. It's one big party here. I guess that's my sum up thought. This is a difficult situation in a lot of the state as we have more and more production needed, more and more of the major aquifers and the old sources of water that are depleting. These are the areas that are going to get explored. These are the areas that we are going to be developing, and it's the areas that we know the least about and that we have the least management in place for. And so that's my sum up, along with we need that data. So Natalie has said she would like just a moment to drive home the point about we really, really need data in your districts.
Yes, we really need data in your districts. And if you are not already sending your data to our groundwater data team, we'll come find you. But no, really, all the data we can, and of course, money to districts to make that happen would definitely be ideal.
I'd like to see some of this money you're talking about.
I don't know where it is.
Okay, a 2-minute sum up from whoever's next. Bill, 2 minutes. You got a summary thought? Nope, you already said it. Kevin?
Yeah, I think I'd like to say data is important. I work for Presidio County too. I know Trey's out there. So Presidio County's really got a pretty aggressive program to get out and get more monitoring wells installed and devices in them, and I'm helping with that. Brewster County's getting there. We are, as Charles said earlier, our budget used to be tiny. It's not much bigger, but at least we have a little bit more now. But then we don't have any more than 9 production permits too. So that's not where the income comes from. It comes from the county. But yet we do have a budget to come to these meetings and put in wells and stuff and maybe collect more data, but we definitely need it. But the other thing that I'm really curious to find out from others in this room is it comes back to DFCs. Do we have enough data to actually say whether we're anywhere close or what is, our target DFC for Brewster for the igneous in Brewster's 10 feet. And then in the rules, we said for the Santa Elena that we want to see 0. How do we track that? I mean, we don't really have that way of doing that. So Brewster County really needs some more data.
Yeah.
Period.
I gave a different presentation at TAG that talked about that very issue here a couple of years ago that said, if you say you're going to do it, you better do it, and you better track that you're doing it. And so but it's difficult, especially in these newer developed areas where there is so little data. This is the next frontier, I think. This is the next thing that we need to be thinking about. And I think Natalie probably would agree with this. There's no current legislative requirement that any of that be like put in a report or any kind of specific way, but good management requires that we say what we're going to do.
Well, no, one of the things in the management plan is how are you tracking the DFC. Mm-hmm. So your presentation from 2 years ago was correct. If you're going to develop a DFC, you have to know how you're going to track it. And so in the GMAs I have been working with, I try and advise that think about whether you really want a DFC because you're going to be responsible for monitoring it, tracking it, and understanding it. And if you don't have the data, don't be shy about the fact that maybe we don't need a DFC.
Right. You need the data to develop that.
But you continue to develop it because to me personally, the real threshold for a DFC is, are you affecting another district? In whatever you're doing, are you somehow affecting another district? And if the answer to that is no, that's what I call not relevant for purposes of joint planning. And so in your case, no, you don't want a DFC because that little portion of the aquifer is not affecting anybody else in GMA 4.
But that doesn't mean your district can't manage it.
But you're still managing it for your own purposes, just like La Pan, just like a lot of other places that I work, where we've designated it not relevant just because we want to keep that local, but joint planning means, is that your management choices affecting your neighbors? And if the answer is no, don't do a DFC.
Well, we might be, though. Trey may disagree because we are sharing that igneous aquifer. But on the other hand, it is, as I described earlier, all these disconnected, maybe is it connected or not? That's really the question for us.
But that's the question you want to work with Amy and the data that you do have to be able to answer that threshold question. Because if you're not affecting Trey, why do you want one? Because that just creates a monitoring and bureaucratic headache in your management plan.
Yeah, but we already have one.
You don't have what?
We already have a DFC.
Yeah, they
So-
have one
Do you
in
have
school.
it? Do you have it in a GMA report?
Yeah, I believe so.
No.
I'm pretty sure ours is
No,
10.
not
No.
the EMA.
It's not.
You have
okay.
it in your local.
Yeah, we have it in in our
Yeah.
management plan.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I did your explanatory report last
Okay.
time. You don't have it.
If you think you haven't worked with Bill,
I guess you would know.
okay. So I think the sum up here, there is no easy button. There is no easy button. We need more data. We need more studying of these minor aquifers. These are the next frontier, and let's do this. There's the people in this room that can do this. Let's do this. I guess, Adam, do we have a second for questions, or are you done with us?
Are there any questions from the audience? We did have a couple come in, and I'm not quite sure what this first one is referring to, but I'm going to go ahead and read it anyway. Any thoughts or considerations on surface water, groundwater interactions, that is data needs, and how that might lead to reduction in rejected recharge as minor aquifers contribute to larger aquifers?
Okay, so again, going back to the danger here of naming an aquifer and making people think that or leading people to think that maybe it's its own entity. And I talked about how they're connected, one aquifer to the next. Well, that also is true for surface water and shallow groundwater. That just like I said, we tracked about 13 to 25% of the pumping was sourced from The minor aquifers flowing vertically downward into the Carrizo, I think the number from the shallow system surface water was upwards of 20%. So there's definitely connections everywhere, and this falls, that a few years ago, the obsession was on total estimated recoverable storage. And everyone wanted to be able to track that. And we heard, Charles Porter talk about ownership of groundwater. Well, just because the water's there right now, and if you start pumping it, you're not just taking water out from under your property, you're taking it from laterally, vertically, and you're pulling water out of surface water sources. And so the challenge with all the data is to basically figure out where that water is coming from, and that's management.
Okay.
Could I add something to that? Back to another thing that Charles Porter was talking about is the treaty and the fact that there's no water in our river. This Lower Canyons location where I like to go canoeing, the Edwards Trinity contributes 185,000 acre feet per year, regardless of whether Mexico's delivering or not. So there's this constant flow of water down there that becomes international. It's a very interesting situation there that's the only water that reaches Amistad during times like we have right now when Mexico is not delivering.
Okay, thank you for that. And this next question, I believe it's already been answered, but I'll go ahead and ask it again. Minor aquifers, how are MAGs and DFCs adjusted when adjoining counties using that aquifer are not part of the Groundwater Conservation District?
How are MAGs and DFCs adjusted when counties are not part of the
Correct.
they don't have a groundwater district?
When they are not a part of the Groundwater District.
When they're not part of a groundwater district, you basically are including DFs for example, in GMA 11, the northern part of the Carrizo-Wilcox, most of that area has no districts. We still calculate drawdowns and MAGs, at least from a modeling standpoint, for that entire area and send it in. Now, in most areas, those then become part of the calculation the Water Development Board does for MAGs that then go to the regional planning groups. In that northeastern part of the state, they make up their own, but they still have to be consistent. It's a complicated thing, but basically you're providing information for the regional planning groups in areas without districts.
Despite the fact that there's no district on site to manage anything to try to meet those DFCs.
Correct. Okay.
Anything else?
Oh, we have one in the audience.
I think you called it the Lipan, the little blue blob. Where does the recharge come from?
Rainfall.
Okay, so you said it fills up and then it's pumped out. Does it retain that water if it's not pumped out? Is it like a natural ASR?
Yeah, basically you're never pumping it totally dry. You're just pumping it down for the wells that are in place. And so as soon as the pumping stops and it starts raining again, it fills back up.
But if it's not pumped, does the water retain in the?
Well, it's just never not pumped. It's always pumped because for irrigation.
Okay.
That's it. Guys, I have good news. I'm no longer standing in your way.